Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art. Your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Imagine There's No Photos, Image Overload and Totalitarianism. It is only when they have the photos before their eyes that they seem to take tangible possession of the day they spent. The irrevocability of what has been and can no longer be doubted. Everything else can drown in the unreliable shadow of memory. Italo Calvino, Adventures of a Photographer. Smile and others will smile back. Smile to show how transparent, how candid you are. Smile if you have nothing to say. Most of all, do not hide the fact that you have nothing to say, nor your total indifference to others. Let this emptiness, this profound indifference shine out spontaneously in your smile. Jean Baudrillard, America. And talk about the profound emptiness of a smile. This is an artificial intelligence enhanced image that I think shows quite well the sense of Baudrillard's quote. Well, hi everybody, and just to get stuck straight into it, there's this quote from Guy Debord, Society of the Spectacle. The spectacle is the nightmare of imprisoned modern society, which ultimately expresses nothing more than its desire to sleep. The spectacle is the guardian of sleep. In a world that has really been turned on its head, truth is a moment of falsehood. Where the real world changes into simple images, the simple images become real beings and effective motivations of hypnotic behaviour. Now, at a future date, I'm going to explore Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle in a lot more depth. But what I like about it is the way he tries to find ways of discussing the overall effect of the increased dominance of society, of spectacles and images in our society, hence the title, The Society of the Spectacle. I think what sets Guy Debord's work apart is the way in which he sees what he calls the spectacle, or this dominance of images, as a defining feature. It's not just about individual images, it's about the cumulative effects, so the quantitative expansion of the number of images in our society has a profound qualitative effect. And that's the major theme of today's talk. And I'm linking it with the concept of totalitarianism. Not to be melodramatic, but I'm interpreting the concept of totalitarianism quite literally. The totalizing aspect of a society in which there is a totally dominant aspect, which I'm going to argue all the way through, is this ubiquity, this prevalence, this preponderance, whatever word you want to use, this tsunami of images that dominate our lives, wherever you, on your mobile phone, smartphone, whenever you go online, we're constantly looking at screens, to the extent, as I'll show, our memories are increasingly, I'd suggest, dominated by artificially produced images. The notion of authentic real time that doesn't involve some type of image capturing. The profound psychological changes, I'd suggest, have happened. And all the more important because I think people have a sense that the world's not the way it used to be, largely because of the dominance of images. But by the same token, I think people play down the true significance of this development. So we'll see later on the idea of the myth of neutrality, the idea that it's not the technology that causes harm, it's how you choose to use it. And that presupposes various issues. It supposes that people can make conscious choices, which theoretically they can, but on any public transport you take, or just look around you, the number of images, the number of screens, the seeming inability of people not to be looking at screens and absorbing images. And even if you actively choose not to, like I often do, try living without a mobile phone. I have to use my wife's number all the time just to fill in online forms. And it's increasingly not possible to participate in the modern world without a smartphone, which comes with this immense temptation to use it to constantly either look at images or to capture images, to be taking images. So where the real world changes into simple images, the simple images become real beings and effective motivations of hypnotic behavior. So Guy Debord is talking about this overarching, profound effect that the spectacle, this agglomeration, concatenation of images is increasingly having. And the obvious earlier reference, and I've put the link in the descriptions box to a previous video where I discussed the allegory of Plato's cave from Plato's Republic. And just to refresh your memory, the idea is he makes the allegory to trying to find the truth, to the normal human condition is to be looking at reflections, shadows on a wall, a cave wall, and we only ever see a dim approximation of the truth. And why I find this interesting is, I think with media technologies and their reliance upon technically completely accurate images, photographic evidence, like slices of reality that are frozen, I think we all presuppose or tend to assume that those media technologies are allowing us to go out into the bright light of the truth, as in this allegory, in this image. And I think most people's common sense in a notion of art and literature is that they're fine for entertainment, even moral edification, you might expand your brain a bit. But in terms of truth, the fact that great art is based upon fiction, and the fact that it's based upon relatively primitive methods, so print or written text or paintings or people actually performing on a stage with minimal set, it's, in a certain sense, hasn't changed for hundreds of years. And therefore, in a sense, it's quite primitive. So I think there's a bias towards thinking that art can't really get to the truth and isn't really designed to get to the truth and is only designed to give us some aesthetic type of pleasure. And I think a strong argument I keep making throughout this channel's output is the idea that actually art is a way of approaching the truth indirectly. And actually, if you try and approach the truth directly, as in photographic imagery, it's no guarantee. And in fact, approaching the truth directly, it's like trying to chase your own shadow. You're always moving away from it because elements of human experience are innately and inherently ambiguous and enigmatic. And that's actually, with all its limitations, that's what art is best qualified to approach. So there's almost like a counterintuitive inverse approach to this image. And it's interesting that whilst it's been interpreted in various ways, and I have an ongoing issue that I'll probably return to in future, that Plato is often misunderstood. Because in this example, he's using an allegory to make a point about the truth. So even in the discussion of the truth, he's using a literary device to express the truth about the truth. And it sounds, layers within layers, but I think that's what Plato's talking about. And the whole of the Republic that Plato wrote, by some people like Karl Popper, when he wrote a book called The Open Society and Its Enemies. He spent it was a massive 2-volume work, he spent a whole volume criticising Plato for being a proto-totalitarian, when Plato is drawing various nuanced approaches to the idea of the truth. And when he has this idea of an ideal republic where philosopher kings and children are taken off into barracks to be educated, it's very much tongue-in-cheek. It's a thought experiment that Karl Popper just doesn't get the irony or the literary devices that Plato uses. So this is an age-old problem. But I'm suggesting that with reference to this image, we are far too dependent upon the idea that there's some bright light of truth, and it'll either be found through the scientific method or through technology, social media, image-based media technologies that represent and capture aspects of reality in a technically accurate form. So this is Susan Sontag's approach to the concept of Plato's cave. Humankind lingers unregenerately in Plato's cave, still reveling its age-old habit in mere images of the truth. But being educated by photographs is not like being educated by older, more artisanal images. Photographs are perhaps the most mysterious of all the objects that make up and thicken the environment we recognize as modern. Photographs really are experience captured, and the camera is the ideal arm of consciousness in its acquisitive mood. So I'm going to keep returning to, in future, this concept of image overload. And today it's going to be like an overview. So I'm going to quote from Susan Sontag and give you references to other thinkers who've thought about the role of photography. But I think as far as all these sometimes quite complex writers go, Susan Sontag's book on photography is very accessible. And there's online versions available, so if you can't get hold of an actual physical copy. But I like the way she is quite clear here, but being educated by photographs is not like being educated by older, more artisanal images. So the question throughout this video is, what's the difference? Why isn't it the same? And she goes on to say, photographs are perhaps the most mysterious of all the objects that make up and thicken the environment we recognize as modern. And that's something she talks about, thickening the environment we recognize as modern. So the texture of the environment we live in is another phrase I think that comes up later on. Photographs are, by their very nature, they seem to represent slices of reality, so they're quite insidious. They slip into our experience of reality and how we, in a modern contemporary society, interact with each other via images, consuming images for entertainment, walking down the street and always trying to capture aspects of real time by having a photographic record of it. All of these aspects, photographs are really are experience captured. And the camera is the ideal arm of consciousness in its acquisitive mood. I think the word captured and the notion of acquisitive, I think she's bang on the nail there. And the issue is, at what point do you actually just live that horrible phrase, lived experience? But it's ironic that that phrase is used all the time now, but never has experience been lived so little and recorded and disseminated so much. People don't live in the moment, to get all Buddhist on you. And I think Sontag's brilliant for the way in which she really does give it to photography for its role, along with other media technologies, in this production. It's not neutral. This idea that the camera is the ideal arm of consciousness, which is quite a strong statement, but also it encourages to think of the relationship between consciousness itself and these new media, which I have to apologise, I will keep banging on about it, but by far the most commonsensical approach to technology is that it's neutral. It's not the technology, it's how you choose to use it that matters. And I'm suggesting no. Along with people like Sontag, I think there are strong arguments to say that our very mode of consciousness, the very way in which we think of ourselves and the world around us, can be profoundly infiltrated by image-based technologies. So I was mentioning, lived experience or engaging with the world around us. Because I have a very dark sense of humour, a while ago I read an article about the number of people who have fatal accidents whilst taking dangerous selfies. And it always just struck me as a Darwinian solution of sorts. The people's insane need to keep taking photos. Rather than just look out at that view and absorb it, this constant having to document it. Print seems a less treacherous form of leaching out the world, of turning it into a mental object, than photographic images, which now provide most of the knowledge people have about the look of the past and the reach of the present. What is written about a person or an event is frankly an interpretation, as are handmade visual statements like paintings and drawings. Photographed images do not seem to be statements about the world so much as pieces of it, miniatures of reality that anyone can make or acquire. So she's used the word acquire again. And elsewhere in On Photography, it's one of my favourite phrases in the book, she talks about photographs document sequences of consumption. I hope she says that, because I'm sure she does. But she's comparing and contrasting the photograph with old-fashioned print. Print seems a less treacherous form of leaching out of the world. And she's asserting, which I think she's writing this in 1977, so she's talking about photographic images which are now provide most of the knowledge people have about the look of the past. So you're talking almost 50 years later, and to the extent that people have even more of the knowledge they have of the world around them is through images, digital images this time, which is photography on steroids. And then she distinguishes what is written about a person or an event as frankly an interpretation, as are handmade visual statements like paintings and drawings. Photographed images do not seem to be statements about the world so much as pieces of it, miniatures of reality that anyone can make or acquire. So this role of interpretation. And why I was keen to look at this whole topic, I want to focus on that word interpretation, because irrespective of your politics or irrespective of your position on controversial topics, what I've found in recent months and years of trying to engage with people online in various formats is that I'm generally, and having previously taught 18 to 21, 22-year-olds, it's the way in which the ability to interpret, and I just want to emphasize that I'm not saying people should have one view or another, but when people are disagreeing, one of the aspects of online environments that I'm increasingly noticing is the inability to interpret why they're disagreeing. So I've encountered, and I'm sure you have, the way in which you'll make a statement, or there will be a controversy online that I can think of recently, and people's engagement with the controversy is not based upon often what is actually said at the time, or when people reply and try and put forward an argument, the idea of parallel monologues, people tend to argue at cross purposes, And it's just to reiterate, it's not the fact people disagree that bothers me in the slightest. It's they don't know why they're disagreeing. Because the ability to interpret an argument really seems to be suffering these days. And it might sound like a stretch, but I always take it back to my perception that a loss of literacy, the very beginning there of this quotation, print seems a less treacherous form of leeching. Print is less treacherous because it demands interpretation. If you're literate, if you're trained to read and you read a lot, everything is to be evaluated. Sentences build up into paragraphs, paragraphs build up into sections and then chapters, and properly written arguments have a good inherent structure. And this is not what's happening in the world of online throwing spaghetti at a wall and everyone's arguing in parallel monologues. But this handmade visual statements, this idea of artisanal production versus photographed images, do not seem to be statements about the world so much as pieces of it. So there's an inherent aspect of photographs that unless they've been doctored or unless they're particularly artistic, and I do recognise photography in certain aspects can be an art when it's practiced by brilliant photographers, but that's not the type of photograph most people are looking at most of the time. And there's a tautological element of photographs. They are what they are, they say what they say, they encapsulate, they portray with total technical accuracy what they're designed to portray. But this notion of interpretation is completely absent. And when you live in a society where most students are constantly getting information filtered through photographic forms, I really witnessed at first hand how this began to affect their ability to logically think. But having said all of that, again, I just want to re-emphasize I'm not anti-photograph. So this is I was going to talk about the iconicity, the way in which photographs can provide iconic representations. But another thing to think about is to what extent are icon-like photographs possible in a world where, compared to when this was taken, there are so many more photographs. So I was going to, this idea of so many more photographs than were in the past, given the timescale of this photograph, I was going to say, if you're going to crash a train, do it properly. But just the weight of the actual object that's managed to go through a stone building, and that, in order to process that image, photographic plates have had to be developed. There's a solidity to the whole thing that is, I would suggest, completely lacking in digital photographs that are designed for instant transmission. And you take so many more digital photographs because you can. There's no need to have them processed chemically. Which begs the question, so to what extent are we engaging with reality? I would suggest that strikes me as a singular moment. And that's how people tended in the past to engage with photography in its early days. And this is what photography is capable of. A painter could paint something like that, but you wouldn't... That whole experience is premised upon the ability to take a photograph. An artist, I suppose, could have imagined it before photography, but not really. It really does require the technology. assuming, of course, I think maybe some viewers will question the validity of the moon landings and astronauts in general, as they are. I just think I've offended all the flat earthers out there. But as a thought experiment, thinking along the lines of the title, imagine if there were many less photographs, so that photographs like this could still have a profound effect. Where I seem to remember reading anecdotal reports of astronauts who'd looked on Earth after the first few astronauts, and there was a slight anticlimax because they'd seen so many photos of images like this. So when they saw them themselves, it had less of an effect. But then you've got iconic images like this. And this has a personal linked, or I have a personal response to this, because as fate would have it, I think this happened on a Tuesday morning, and if I'm right, I'd flown to New York on the Saturday before, and I flew out about a week after this happened. I saw the second plane hit live on my friend's television in Massapequa, Long Island, and then there's layers upon layers that I experienced because I'm in the vicinity. You could see the smoke in the distance. I've seen it happen live on television. And then when I flew out a week later, the crater, you could see the crater, you flew directly above it. And just the scale of the carnage, the size. So I got to see that. So it was a complex mix of representations. But in the week before, after it happened, and before I flew home, what I'll never forget is the constant replication of the images and the videos being shown on American television. And the absence of any substantive discussion, because the images spoke for themselves, and before the full geopolitical implications had been borne out or the causes were fully known, all you could really do was look at the images. But it was endless, constant showing of the images. And I understand it's a completely extreme instant, an incident, but it's almost like it represents TV news in general, the showing of images, not totally, but largely devoid of substantial context, because the images speak for themselves. And I'm sorry to put on a lighter note, but I remember this thing about the images, us being too reliant upon them. I remember when I was really young watching a lunchtime news program, and there was someone giving a interview from Heathrow Airport, and the director had wanted the shot so that the person with the microphone would have a plane behind him. But as the plane came up behind him to give the perfect TV shot, the idiot director had forgotten planes make quite a lot of noise, so they had to go away from the reporter because they couldn't hear him speak. This idea, the way in which the images, the demand for the images dominates everything else in the context of the particular story. And that is one aspect that I think, like I say, in extreme examples like this, I think it becomes more obvious, because at the time people realise all they were seeing were the images. Normally, because there's a constant stream of different images and people are talking about different issues, I think the over-reliance upon the image is often, it's still under the surface. There's a lack of substance to the discussion, but we tend not to notice it as much. And this was Jason Cox he commented on the channel's feedback section, And he made a very good point, because it was a throwaway comment in the video I did on Francis Bacon, but Francis Bacon made a bit of a catty comment about abstract art not being very good or whatever. And Jason made some interesting points. And I liked it, and I'm going to quote it because I think it goes straight to this point about what good art and literature do is abstract from. So the previous example I gave of the Twin Towers, there's no abstraction. What you're seeing is the Twin Towers. What you're seeing is the full technical aspect of reality, the thing that happened, shown again and again and again. What art and literature do is abstract away from the specifics of reality in order to say something important. So to put it back to the Plato's allegory of the cave, good art and literature does something with the shadows on the wall. It doesn't go outside the cave and take a photograph and think that's the truth. So I think Jason's identification of abstraction as a key issue is crucial. So, sorry, I've noticed a typo immediately. It should say an allusion, A-L-L-U-S-I-O-N, so apologies for that. We don't so readily expect a meaning or an allusion to something else with music. So he's making the point, music is exempt from this notion that it has to have a direct meaning. So I think he's implying, why should art, especially visual art, why should it necessarily have to have an explicit meaning? Photographs have an explicit meaning because the content of the photograph is a slice of reality. Isn't what we love about Van Gogh's chair, as opposed to a photograph of it, the abstraction of perspective and colour? He didn't expect us to believe the steeple was that wonky, or the colours so vivid, unless you achieved a mental state that wasn't ordinary realism or vapidly photographic. The camera annihilated everything but abstraction. Abstraction is the only way to express everything in one frame. Cubism. So immediately after this, I'll give you specific examples, which I'm assuming Jason was thinking about when he's talking about the steeple and the chair. And I'll give an example of Cubism that I think illustrates his point as well. But I think it's crucial what he's saying here. A mental state that wasn't ordinary realism or vapidly photographic. I like the contrast, the vapidly photographic. We tend to think the photographic almost as pseudo-scientific, complete accuracy. When this notion that it actually can be vapid, it lacks abstract. It's completely counterintuitive, but artistic abstraction can contain great depth. And that's normally the exact opposite of what you think about from the term abstraction. And the idea that something I hadn't really thought about, the way in which abstraction is one of the few things that survives the onslaught of photographic images. The camera annihilated everything but abstraction. And then the way in which an artistic form like Cubism can try, admittedly it's always going to fail, but it can try and express everything in one frame. So just to back up Jason's points and give some practical illustrations, the chair, the steeple, and an example of Cubism. So there's Van Gogh's chair. And I'm guessing that's either this or something similar as what Jason was thinking about. But that is definitely a wonky, if not steeple, a wonky church. And then there's obviously so many Cubist paintings or pictures I could have shown, but I quite like this as an example of trying to express everything at once, knowing you're going to fail, but that's ironically the effect that art achieves. Glorious failure, success through failure. I could be my personal life motto. This idea of the image of technology. What I mean by this is how technology mediates the image. So again, people tend to think, there's so many times, I think the dominant idea people have is that technology is neutral. But the way in which technology processes images is absolutely crucial. So I'll just quickly give an overview of people I may go back to in future videos, but this is not, I'll try and get the dates right for you, but 1935, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, Walter Benjamin. And it's an interesting essay because at one level, he's totally in favour of new technologies. He sees them as liberating. He was a neo-Marxist, strong socialist, was escaping Germany they died in 1939, trying to escape Germany to get to America. And the idea in his essay is the idea that he talks about aura, which is defined as a unique point in space and time. And part of his argument was the aura, the uniqueness of art. So in the past, for example, you would have had to go to a church to see a painting or hear music. And so it's linked with, art was always associated with the ritual. The earliest cave paintings, you'd have to go, they were probably part of a ritual. You'd have to go deep into the earth to see the picture. Then, as ritual increasingly became less important in society, he talks about the next stage, which is exhibition. So the Impressionists in the 1860s onwards would, as the Salon in France, routinely did, but the Impressionists had their exhibitions. That type of exhibition, just one example. Art is exhibited for consumption as an aesthetic entity because it's no longer ritualized as much. Obviously, church art still exists, but that used to be the only way it was consumed. Then you have exhibition, and then the third stage is this concept of mechanical reproduction. And when you have mechanical reproduction, when many, many copies can be made, the role of ritual is definitely less important, and exhibition becomes less important. Why would you have to go to an exhibition when you can just look at photographs or you can see reproductions elsewhere? And then arguably, someone like Baudrillard has a further stage where, I think he called it the fractal, where with digital technology, it goes beyond, it's like photography on steroids. So images aren't what they used to be since time immemorial. I think that's one of the epigraphs at the beginning of the essay by Paul Valéry. Images change through technology in quite a profound way. And then Martin Haidiger, German philosopher, and in 1954, he wasn't writing about images particularly, but the essay, The Question Concerning Technology, is about the way in which technology encourages us to see the world in a certain way, and it's very close to Sontag's notion of the acquisitive. So he uses examples, I think he uses a dam, hydroelectric dam versus a windmill. The hydroelectric dam really captures its acquisitive in its relationship to nature, whereas a windmill is much more passive. And he talks about the various ways in which, most interestingly in this regard with images, there's a concept of withdrawal. And the idea is, if you use any type of technology, so if you're digging with a spade, you can smell and see the soil as you break it up. If you got into a digger, like a mechanical digger with a little glass cubicle, you've withdrawn more from the direct experience. Now with images, we're withdrawing from reality, but in the guise of being shown that very reality in image form. So it's a bit more subtle. We're withdrawing, we're seeing things from the other side of the world on a screen, but you feel involved because you can see it. And it sounds convoluted, but basically we've withdrawn from direct reality, but we've withdrawn from our consciousness that we've withdrawn because it seems so realistic and so upfront and personal. So it's the notion of withdrawal from withdrawal. It sounds, you know, what would be the word? Very convoluted, but I think there's an important point being made. There's the insidious, subtle nature of images that distract us, which is a theme I'll talk about later. But it's a way in which we're distracted from the way in which the images and how they're processed affects how we're understanding what they actually signify. So beyond what they're showing us, the way in which we're experiencing them has an effect on us that I would argue we're not fully aware of. I think this is the importance of Heidegger's essay. And this is Marshall McLuhan. The idea that it's not the content of the message that's really being communicated. It's McLuhan's counterintuitive point. What's really being communicated is the effect of the form in which we're experiencing the content of the message. And that's what I've basically been trying to explain. But McLuhan, you know, has this gift for encapsulating it in such a catchy phrase. Talking of which, the Society of the Spectacle. So I'm just trying to remember as I go through these. Walter Benjamin's 1935, Martin Heidegger's 1954, Marshall McLuhan's 1964, Guy Debord's 1967, and the idea of the accumulation of images, the agglomeration, the quantity, the growing quantity has a qualitative effect, is the major theme of the Society of the Spectacle. And then I think Sontag on Photography is 1977, and Roland Barthes' Camera Lucida 1980. It's like playing chronological bingo here. I think it's 1980. And then Simulation and Simulacra, Jean Baudrillard's 81. But I'll hopefully look at some of these in future, but particularly Roland Barthes' Camera Lucida. It's a very detailed look. Not particularly critical. It's more, he starts off on a very, it's quite personal. He talks about a picture of his mother from the late 1800s. And then all the way through the book, Camera Lucida, he discusses various iconic photographs. And he just a very quick highlight is he distinguishes between the studium, he calls it the studium, and the punctum. The studium is the overall context through which you understand a photograph. So if you saw a photograph of the deep south of America, you would understand the context immediately if the vegetation whatever gave it away. Whereas the punctum is the thing that pierces you, punctures, the idea that gives you, it might be a little detail in the photograph that stands out. They're two, the one's the general context and one's the very specific aspect. So I think he talks about the collar, the old-fashioned collar of his mother's dress or something. I need to reread it. It's ages since I have. And then Jean Baudrillard's Simulacra and Simulation, it's what I mentioned about Walter Benjamin. It's the further stages of when photography gets into the digital stage. And we're so immersed in images all around us that the actual status, what Benjamin called aura, a unique point in space and time, according to Baudrillard, that begins to become undermined by there are so many images that the status of the original, any notion of original reality, gets undermined. So building upon all of that, what I wanted to emphasize was this distinction between the mind's lens. Instead of saying the mind's eye, I said the mind's lens. The way in which even the way we can imagine the world around us becomes affected by camera lenses. So there are various writers I'll mention in a second who have thought about how cameras may affect the way, even the way we imagine the world. And then the political consequences of if imagination is more controlled or more dependent upon technological means, what might be the political implications of that? So these are three. I always go back to Marcel Proust and bore you senseless, à la recherche Pompidou, in search of lost time. Italo Calvino, I've given you a quote from that, and I'll give you another one later. But in their different ways, Marcel Proust is basically describing a time in which experience wasn't technologically mediated. And Proust himself in real life, his life spanned massive technological change. So when he was younger, nearly everything would be, communication would be mostly in letter form. And as he got, he died, was it, I'm trying to remember when he died, roughly 1919 in my head, but it's probably wrong. But he died, he saw the turn of the 1900s. The early days of cinema was arriving. Photography's taken off, telegrams, I think the telephone had started. So lots of things are going on, whereas In Search of Lost Time is almost like a paean, a panegyric to past times where things were experienced much more directly. They weren't mediated through technological means. And the major theme of the book is involuntary memory, the way in which human beings can't fully control our memories because stimuluses can happen, stimuli, whereby in the book his mother makes him a cup of tea and he remembers when he was younger having madeleines, these half cake, half biscuits that you dip in the tea. He remembers at one point he stubs his toe on a cobblestone, and that brings memories flooding back. And that's an aspect of life that's serendipitous, it's spontaneous, it's not preordained in digitally captured clouds. Whereas more and more of human experience now is digitally captured. So I think, was it Ulysses, James Joyce, was about 1922, so I'd suggest it's around about the time Proust is dying. Joyce has written Ulysses. These are the great, great novels just before literature became less and less important. And Calvino's brilliant for the way in which he identifies as a novelist. Marshall McLuhan argues novelists are uniquely suited for understanding the sense ratios and how they're changed by new technologies. So The Adventures of a Photographer, brilliant short story that encapsulates the madness of constantly taking photos. So they're two novelists, and then Thomas Nagel is a neuroscientist, philosopher. He's a philosopher who's fascinated by the concept of consciousness. And he did this quite famous, provocative scientific paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat?, which is the thought experiment about what would it be like to be in a bat's brain? And one of the elements of the article that I think is relevant to all this is he's basically arguing that even if you could get inside a bat's head and be subject to some of its sensory perceptions, because you didn't grow up as a bat, you wouldn't have the full experience. And this goes to the concept of what consciousness is and its difference to just mere sense perceptions, sensory data. And this goes to an argument I was having with people online when I did a talk that involved my argument that a unique aspect of being human is the constitutive role of language in the way we think. And some of the feedback was, well, no, animals have language. Well, yes and no. They can communicate. Whales arguably have quite a complex mode of communication, but it's nowhere near human level. And I don't think it's as important to what it is to be a whale, the notion of language. We don't know, but I'm guessing if you swim around in a massive ocean, there's just a lot less going on than the need to be an adaptable human being in an ever-changing world that isn't, a monotone motion. And language, the notion of thought, what constitutes a thought, I would argue genuine human thought. You can have sense perceptions as an animal, and you can have reactions to sense perceptions. And you can have almost, dogs and cats, I'm sure, have some type of primitive emotion. But detailed conceptual thought in a human form seems to require language. Otherwise, they're just poorly organized sense perceptions. And there's a whole raft of cognitive scientists who do work in this area. And it didn't strike me as a particularly provocative thing to say. But I think the lack of importance they place on language is all part of this, the loss of the abstractive power of art and literature that past generations would take for granted. And because there are so many images, because everything's mediated so strongly now, I think people value sense perceptions much more than they ever used to, or seem to think that that's almost a substitute for human essence. And Thomas Nagel did this, what is it like to be a bat? Another one was Catherine Hales from memory, did a paper years ago about what goes on in a frog's brain. And I think the point she was making was a frog's eye and a frog's brain are interwoven in order to calibrate and take notice of what it takes to catch a fly. So speed, peripheral movement, that helps the tongue fly out and catch a fly. So the animal's embodied nature affects how it not only perceives the world, but then how it thinks. So as far as we can tell, a frog's overwhelming mode of thinking is to do with speed. Just like on a closer animal as opposed to humans is dogs. Their ways of thinking, I assume, are much more, or their senses are much more smell-orientated than human beings. Vastly more. And that would affect the whole of the way you interact with the world around you. And this is all just a convoluted way of saying, as human beings, with the unique ability to have language to the level that we do, and to be able to conceptualize abstractly, as Jason Cox pointed out, that's going increasingly by the wayside, this ability to interpret, if we become more and more reliant upon images to the exclusion of literate and artistic values. But this idea of political imagination, what might be the political consequences of the things I'm suggesting are being lost? So Ismail Kadare is an Albanian author, novelist, and The Palace of Dreams is this lovely novel, a short novel about the totalitarian government that thinks people's dreams and their subconscious thoughts might be useful and powerful. So everyone has to report their dreams, and people go around, bureaucrats go around collecting them. And the last one, just to jump ahead, you can guess what the word says, but I'm worried about triggering the YouTube automatic censors if you refer to aspects of the 1930s and 40s. But Charlotte Berrett was a Jewish journalist who collected, as the totalitarian government of the day was rising in the 30s, she went round and secretly took down people's dreams and found this fascinating relationship that the subconscious nightmares people were having in a way, reflected the reality of the external political situation better than their conscious thoughts. Because consciously, when awake, they might say, oh, things aren't that bad, things won't get any worse. When they went to sleep and had nightmares, their subconscious told them the truth. So I find that an interesting notion, the way in which our human imagination using images is very powerful. But then the three authors in the middle, Hannah Arendt, Robert J. Lifton, and Matthias Desmet, I would suggest that the Kadare and the Bera, the notion of how we interpret our dreams and the directness of our subconscious, these are complex issues that sit uncomfortably in a totalitarian society. Your most private, your most subconscious aspects, the powers that be try to control. And where all this was going in my head was how I see all these things linked. Is that to what extent do you have privacy of thought? To what extent do you have control over your own dreams? When a lot of the raw material of today's experience is digitally captured. A lot of what used to be in Proust's time, direct lived experience, actually has been filtered. The environments we live in are much more commodified. The environments we live in, we're constantly taking photos or seeing ourselves in those environments. There's much less spontaneous, organic existence in that sense. So why I'm interested in Arendt, Lifton, and Desmet, this notion of totalitarianism, it's the degree to which all the things I've been talking about how images and the way they're processed may have negative effects compared to how print and art used to work. If photographs were just one thing amongst many others and digital technologies were one thing amongst many others in society, it wouldn't be a problem. But the point is, this aspect of totalitarianism in its most limited literal sense is a society totally dominated, totalism. And the Lifton book is about, he worked in the Air Force as a psychiatrist after the Second World War, and in 1951 he went to Hong Kong to help with the debriefing and therapeutic work with Westerners who'd been captured or failed to leave China when they had the chance, and under the communist Chinese government were put through basically brainwashing, which he refers to as thought reform. And the psychology of totalism is the Communist Party in China, the Cultural Revolution, all these things were about the total domination of one particular ideology. Hannah Arendt talking about the way in which the situation in Germany in the 30s and 40s could become such a total dominating aspect of a society. And Matthias Desmet's book takes this up to the modern day with things like pandemic lockdowns. But all this, I just think totalitarianism, when digital technologies have become so ubiquitous, have become so prevalent, you can actually see in the world around us at university campuses, blue-haired crazy young people shouting at people rather than engaging in actual debate. They're actual, in various ways, which maybe I can trace in future videos, there are parallels with some of the worst aspects of totalitarian societies. So in the Chinese example, there would be struggle sessions. You're shouted at until you basically get with the program, which strikes me as some of the mode of interactions that you can see all the time in protests and counter-protests. But this idea of Italo Calvino, the madness that can ensue when this need or felt need to take so many photographs raises its head. Because once you've begun, he would preach, there is no reason why you should stop. The line between the reality that is photographed because it seems beautiful to us and the reality that seems beautiful because it has been photographed is very narrow. The minute you start saying something, how beautiful, we must photograph it, you're already close to the view of the person who thinks that everything that is not photographed is lost, as if it had never existed, and that therefore, in order really to live, you must photograph as much as you can, and to photograph as much as you can, you must either live in the most photographable way possible, or else consider photographable every moment of your life. The first course leads to stupidity, the second to madness. I'm guessing Calvino's writing here about 50 years ago, if not more. So he's talking about old-fashioned, chemically processed cameras needing rolls of film. Imagine how much more exacerbated all that is with the advent of digital technology. In order really to live, you must photograph as much as you can. So it's incredibly prescient. The whole TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, influencers, or else consider photographable every moment of your life. I think he's giving ahead of his time, he's given such a brilliant description. The first course leads to stupidity, the second to madness. And also what it leads to is a complete confusion over what's authentic anymore and what's the original. So it's one of the ironies of a society full of commodities, that everything's standardized, and yet there's still simultaneously this obsession about being original and authentic. So you can get limited edition chocolate bars, there's only God knows how many thousands made. But in the video I did on real space, fake space in the Liverpool cathedrals, this is one of the examples I used whereby this is a bar in Scotland. I think this is Glasgow. It's based upon a Boston sports bar, which was in turn based upon an Irish bar. So you've got this bricolage, this melange of different influences. And trust me, Scotland is not short of a few pubs. Why you would think that this fake originality has to be re-imported into a country that doesn't need it. It's the way in which the fake originals take on a life of their own. So then Hannah Arendt says, the fundamental reason for the superiority of totalitarian propaganda over the propaganda of other parties and movements is that its content is no longer an objective issue about which people may have opinions, but has become as real and untouchable an element in their lives as the rules of arithmetic. The organisation of the entire texture of life according to an ideology can be fully carried out only under a totalitarian regime. I've picked this because I do see the loss, I've mentioned earlier, the loss of the ability to argue over contentious issues and engage in argumentation rather than this rigid, reified, no longer an objective issue about which people may have opinions. There are now ideological truths in Western democracies that cannot be debated by tribal oppositions. And then other aspects has become as real and untouchable an element in their lives as the rules of arithmetic. So certain ideologies I can think of are just not open for discussion. They're like rules of arithmetic, which is ironic because huge swathes of young people now are innumerate and illiterate. But the organisation of the entire texture of life. And when I read untouchable an element in their lives as the rules of arithmetic, it also struck me, probably it's a slight tangent to the actual, because I'm overlaying my own interpretation in modern times upon Hannah Arendt's earlier analysis. But it strikes me as relevant or apposite to, if you suggested to someone, I think I might have used this example before, but if you suggested to a young person being bullied online, well, maybe you should get offline, give yourself a break. That would be almost like trying to break the rules of arithmetic. It doesn't compute. Because the notion of living without online experience has become, it's no longer an objective issue about which people may have opinions. It's become one of the rules of arithmetic. The organisation of the entire texture of life according to an ideology. So this dominance of online, the need for online presence. I'm just pointing here to Hannah Arendt talking about genuinely totalitarian regimes like Germany in the 30s and the Soviet Union in the 50s and onwards. Well, sorry, also obviously the Soviet Union had totalitarian tendencies before. But Stalin, for example, to be more specific, Stalin during his pomp and prime, I think he died, was it 53 or 54? But we tend to think that those totalitarian regimes are the exception. And I'm not suggesting we live in times that are as bad, but I'm just suggesting in terms of the totality of one particular ideology or the ideological aspects of mediated images that have become total in our society. There are some worrying parallels that I think can be made. So just to start finishing up, but I think this is a brilliant picture, because being implicitly critical of photography for the whole talk, and again, it's not photography as such, it's the fact that it's the quantitative expansion is such now that photography has taken on a qualitatively different aspect. But if I'm going to be realistic, I'm going to suggest we are in the end times, if not, we've already passed the end times, where art and literature have been left behind. We've entered a new realm, if not quite a while ago. So, like I said, personally, I think literature reached its peak in the 1920s, arguably. But this is a wonderful example of what photography can do. And McLuhan uses this, not this particular image, but he uses the example of a plane. This is an American fighter jet breaking the sound barrier. Just before an airplane breaks the sound barrier, sound waves become visible on the wings of the plane. The sudden visibility of sound just as sound ends is an apt instance of that great pattern of being that reveals new and opposite forms. Just as the earlier forms reach their peak performance. So he's basically saying we only truly understand a particular format as we're leaving it behind. We see its contours properly. So just as this fighter pilot is broken the sound barrier, it's almost going through a portal into another realm. And this is Desmet. Dictatorships are based on a primitive psychological mechanism namely on the creation of a climate of fear amongst the population based on the brutal potential of the dictatorial regime. Totalitarianism, on the other hand, has its roots in the insidious psychological process of mass formation. Mass formation is in essence a kind of group hypnosis that destroys individuals' ethical self-awareness and robs them of their ability to think critically. This process is insidious in nature. And I'll just ask you, I've italicized mass formation. If you think of mass formation here and mass formations and group hypnosis, I don't think it's much of a stretch to suggest with the absolute predominance, and not just the predominance, but the homogeneity that online media tend to encourage. You know, people being ostracized and the psychological harm that causes, the need to feel that you belong into this type of mass formation. And because it's not over Germany in the 1930s type totalitarianism or Soviet Union totalitarianism, this process is insidious in nature. I'll just finish with this. I've used it before and I'm sure I'll use it again. I just think it's a brilliant encapsulation of what's going on. I'm in the position of Louis Pasteur telling doctors that their greatest enemy was quite invisible and quite unrecognised by them. Our conventional response to all media, namely that it is how they are used that counts, is the numb stance of the technological idiot. For the content of a medium is like the juicy piece of meat carried by the burglar to distract the watchdog of the mind. That goes to the previous quote about the insidious nature of the process. When you engage with an art form, when you read a difficult literary work, you're being asked to constantly reflect upon the effect it's having upon you. Whereas the insidious nature of the media, I think McLuhan just sums it up brilliantly. The content of a medium is like the juicy piece of meat carried by the burglar to distract the watchdog of the mind. We're completely oblivious to the effect it's having on us whilst it's having that effect, because we're looking elsewhere. And if we're not looking elsewhere, we're looking at ourselves, which brings me to the very final image. So I hope you enjoyed that. All the very best. Take care.